Recently, Ajahn has been giving some teachings about renunciation, which is a quality, a practice that is of fundamental importance in the practice of the Buddha's teachings. Without renunciation, we get nowhere. Because renunciation literally means giving up things that you're attached to, giving up your desires, giving up attachments, which is what the practice is. The whole practice is for that, to be free from desires, be free totally from attachments. So if we're not prepared to give up things that we're attached to, give up the fact of being attached to things, then we're not really in the right place. First of all, it's useful to examine what it actually means to renounce, renunciation. How it's often thought of is the renunciation of a householder who goes to become a monk, and it's often also spoken of as being mainly the renunciation involved in celibacy, giving up sexual relationships, giving up romantic relationships, giving up having a family. And all this is a big part of the practice of renunciation, but it's not only that, and it's important to understand the entirety of what it actually means, and in particular to get the fact that renunciation is not just giving up not having any more of a particular object. It is the attachment to pleasant things in the world, the attachment to comfort zones in the world, that is to be given up. So just merely to be a monk, for example, is not necessarily renunciation, because it is quite possible to have quite a good comfort zone as a monk. You can get used to the fact of not eating in the afternoon or eating only once a day. There is respect and admiration of lay people wherever you go. There's no need to pay rent or pay bills or to be harried by an irritated boss. Nobody dares to speak to you rudely or disrespectfully. So there's no confrontation. So there's many things even in this life that is supposedly the life of a renunciate that can be very comfortable, very agreeable to stay in. So that's not to say that it's a problem to be a monk, because obviously the Buddha designed the way that the monk lives as being the best opportunity for practice, the best situation or the best environment for practice. But it is just to say that one doesn't necessarily renounce just by becoming a monk. The case in point, there is one video that we watched recently that had been made about a monk, a Canadian monk who was living in the north of Thailand in the forest alone in a little hermitage. And you see in the video how all the scenery around is so beautiful, and he goes to walk for several kilometers a day on his alms round, and he has a cat, and he talks about freedom, about purity, and about how he's living his life for the sake of this. But then right after that we found a little news clipping from just 2 years ago, which involved this same monk who was now apparently being disrobed because he had admitted to having had sexual relationships with women. So one might think, looking at the first video, that this is somebody who has renounced, this is somebody who is living a pure life. But in fact, if you look at it again, you see how actually this monk has sort of gathered his own sort of comfort zone around himself. He is alone, so he can do whatever he wants, he can live however he wants, he doesn't have anybody to bother him, he's able to eat the type of food that he wants. You see him doing yoga, you see him talking about detoxing the body, so he's sort of, you see actually he's keeping everything that he likes. He keeps all the type of views that he likes, all the type of practices that he likes, and he just removes the things that he doesn't like. So actually living the life of a monk is for him, a way of having whatever he likes and removing whatever he doesn't like. And so then, of course, since it's not a real renunciation, he went as far as breaking the first fundamental law of celibacy of the monks. So of course I have no wish to make a personal attack on this particular monk. I do not know him, I know nothing about his life or about his mind or anything. But it's just a case in point of how the mind works, how the mind of everybody works, including you and I. Our natural tendency since the day that we were born is to keep whatever we like and remove whatever we don't like. And when it comes to meditation, we end up doing the same thing, unless we have really understood what renunciation means and why we do it. That is, out of understanding that attachment is suffering, is the cause of suffering, wishing to go out of the suffering of attachment, We renounce the attachments that tie us to suffering. One who renounces in this way has to have had at some point the realization that there is no pleasant thing in this world that is worth the suffering that comes when one is addicted to it, when one makes self with it, when one is dependent on it. Nothing in the world is worth sticking to. Nothing in the world is worth holding on to. Therefore, one decides to give up even those things that we would most dearly love to hold on to. Especially those things. The thing that you are most sticky to will bring you the most suffering. And it's a good point to mention here that for lay people, generosity is very closely related to renunciation, and it's actually the means by which one starts to deliberately give up what is dear, to remove from oneself. And today, especially in Buddhist countries, there is a lot of rite and ritual surrounding this, and people will often give for the sake of transferring merit to their dead relatives, or for the sake of having a long life, beauty, health, and riches in the future. So obviously, this is not true generosity, nor is it real renunciation. It's like somebody saying, I'll give you this piece of apple, and I will get a cake in return. So for generosity to be genuine and to be practiced in the Buddhist teaching, it should be done with the intention of renunciation, the intention of giving up one's time or something that is dear. And I will talk about generosity in particular in more detail separately. But that is how we should understand renunciation in general. Now, why is renunciation so important? What's the difference between a practitioner who has a strong renunciation, who has completely renounced, and somebody who tries to practice but lacks renunciation? Well, the first thing is that there will be a big difference in the clarity of their aim, because when one's aim is clear, this really goes hand in hand with renunciation. If the aim is very clear and very strongly determined, then there is no way for there to be like doubt or wavering in regard to that. So when you fix your aim on the aim of ending suffering and going out of suffering, removing impurities from oneself, then everything that you do, every action that you do, should bring you towards that aim. And so this immediately, automatically leads to renunciation without you having to sort of force yourself to give up things or tear yourself apart giving things up, because it's just like, no, this doesn't bring me to my aim. This is an obstacle. I have to get rid of it. So whether it's sensuality, sexuality, whether it's being dependent on the love of others, whether it's a big attachment to a job, a profession, whatever attachment, whatever dependency that is an obstacle that blocks us in our aim, well, there's no question of keeping it once the aim is really clear and that we're not interested in going for anything else. So they really go very closely hand in hand, these two factors, having a clear aim and the strong renunciation. And on the other hand, somebody who has not determined their aim, who is like wavering between two worlds, in between the life of a layman, in between the life of an ordinary person, who wants to hang on to all the enjoyment that they have in their life and all the attachments that they have, and also wants to be a monk, also wants to practice the Buddha's teaching. Like, it's impossible to really get anywhere in either of these things. There will be no renunciation because your aim is not clear. If you try to practice without being able to renounce, it means you haven't understood why you're practicing. So there will be doubt, confusion, indecision everywhere. And it's very easy to just lose sight of the practice and turn back to one's old comfort zone, one's old habits, whatever that might be. While on the other hand, for somebody who has really renounced, it's as if they have a kind of shield. They will not allow themselves to play with sensual desires or with doubt or with anything that could pull them out of the practice, precisely because they have no other option. Like, when you've really given up every comfort zone, every refuge but Dhamma, then you have no option but to work for your freedom every moment, every day, to work for purity every day, to become your own refuge every moment, because there is nothing else to lean on. You've given up everything else that you were depending on. That's the ultimate renunciation, to depend in no way on anything. And this is something that is to be worked on continually. It's not something you can just do one time and decide one time. Obviously, it also should be mentioned that this renunciation is not something that you can just say, okay, now I renounce, and that's it. Like, you have to understand why you're renouncing. You have to understand why you're giving up. But it's also a misunderstanding to think that you have to have already attained to the fourth jhana and probably be an Arya as well in order to have properly renounced. This is definitely not the case. Certainly, yes, it implies having a certain understanding of the Dhamma, but that does not mean either that one needs to have read the entire Tipitaka, nor to have attained some special state of concentration. All you need to know, all you need to understand really, is simply this, that when there are the dangers of old age, sickness, and death that beset everybody, that there is no use in spending one's life enjoying pleasures and building a kind of sandcastle only to have it slowly or quickly destroyed. Plus the faith that there is a path to go out. That's it. That's all you need. It's like the Bodhisattva before he became the Buddha. He had this. This was all he had. He had no teaching already made for him. He had nobody to instruct him, nobody to tell him what to do. And yet there was absolute clarity in his aim. There was no thought of turning back, no idea of giving up. It was impossible. Similarly, with many of his early disciples like Sariputra and Moggallana, when they left their home lives, they had never heard of the Buddha's teaching. They didn't know, they weren't Sotapanna, they weren't Sagadagami or Anagami, they had not attained to some special state of jhana, but they had seen this fact that what is the use of living this life in this way when everything is going to turn to ashes? What is the point? I have to leave, I have to give up, I have to find the way out of this. So their renunciation is based on this understanding, and if we haven't understood this really deeply, then reading all the words of the Tipitaka will be of no use. Studying will be of no use. Even when we practice meditation, it will not really serve the purpose it is meant to serve in the Buddha's teaching, because we will not be practicing it with the right intention, the right understanding. So as long as we stick to something in this world, sticking to pleasant feelings, being dependent on them, attached to them, we cannot progress to that extent, because it will be us sticking to them. I am attached. I need this to be okay. It doesn't mean, by the way, that we can't have anything pleasant or anything agreeable. In the Buddha's time, and he was doing it himself as a bodhisattva, people were trying to sort of break the attachment to pleasure by force, by torturing the body, but this does not work. Your body gets tortured, the mind cannot be concentrated, and there is no wisdom that arises there. So we have to be clever, wise, know the difference between necessity, what is necessary for decent health and good concentration, and what is sort of extra desire on top of that, attachment to everything being how I want it to be. As long as we depend on things being as we want them to be, it's absolutely 100% sure that we will have anxiety, we will have fear, we will have sadness, grief, crying, pain, distress, and despair for the rest of our lives and for all our lives in the future, as long as we do not give that up, as long as we don't get rid of it. And how the Buddha taught is that really we should see it as kind of a form of insanity to continue to make this same mistake all over and over again. When we keep holding on to things, we keep on suffering, and that's all. And it's such a meager, little, pitiful form of pleasure that we hang on to, compared to the way of renunciation, which is the most beautiful state in the world, to be entirely free, to be just ready to die, not holding on to anything in the world, independent. There can be nothing higher than this, but we forsake this for the sake of such a low, little, pitiful sense of pleasure. Ajahn was giving the example that it's like when you go in an orchard to collect fruit, you have to go with your basket empty. Only then can you collect the fruit. But instead of that, what we all want is to keep the basket full of all the garbage that it's filled with and have the fruit at the same time. So just to go over the main points in this subject, firstly, renunciation is about giving up, letting go from within of attachments and comfort zones. It's not only about being a monk or practicing asceticism or about just not having a specific object. Secondly, when there is proper renunciation, it is done based on the understanding, the deep understanding that anything that we might hold on to will eventually just be a source of suffering. And the more attachment, the more crying. Therefore, we give it up. When it is given up, it makes everything clear. The aim is clear. Everything is in one line, and there will be no confusion, no duality, no wavering. While for somebody who cannot renounce, it goes with an unclear aim. It goes with uncertainty, with doubt, with wavering back and forth. And it's very easy to lose any progress that we might make in Dhamma in the practice. Thirdly, the extent to which we hold on to something that we like, the extent to which we depend on things being as we want, to that extent we will be forever blocked, forever tied to our own selfishness, forever tied to our own suffering, as long as we do not give it up for the sake of something much higher and much more pure.